Hey, if it's anything. All right, l'chaim. I guess we'll say a couple words from the maamar from the Gimel Tammuz in Tafshin Chai 57:18, related to Parshas Korach that we just got from. Um, the maamar starts out talking about how Hashem needs to put our soul in life so our feet does not falter, which means simply enough, which in a simple sense, this beginning of the maamar means that it's not enough to rely on our own nature. The soul itself is already alive. The soul of every Jew is alive. Not only is the soul alive, the soul is alive in essence. Other things, like the body, you could say, in itself is not alive on its own. It needs the soul to give it life. The soul itself is already alive. It's life itself. But even though the soul is already life itself, we say every day in davening that Hashem puts our soul into life so that our feet do not falter. Which means that even though our soul is alive in essence, it's not enough to rely on our own nature. Even that our soul is alive in essence with an essential life that's not dependent on anything else, that's still part of the nature of our soul. And the point is that in order that our feet does not falter, which means that when we learn Torah and we do mitzvahs, then we're like ahead, the highest level. When we go out into the world and it says we know Hashem in all of your ways, then when we go out into worldly matters, then we're like a foot which goes out into the world and does stuff. And when we go out into the world, then it says that then we're able to see Hashem's unity even within the many details of the world. When it comes to the spiritual worlds, we only realize Hashem's greatness not because of the many things, but because of the essential unity that's kind of beyond the division. Spirituality that's beyond physicality, beyond division. When we go out into the worlds, into worldly things, then we're able to see Hashem's unity even within division itself. And it says this is actually what Korach, from last week's parsha, was all cut up about. Korach was very obsessed with this unity of the Creator that he saw even from within the worldly matters. Says when he saw so many details in the world, and he saw that nevertheless Hashem's unity still applies when we have the details, then that caused Korach to want to go more and more into the worldly matters specifically and away from the spiritual in order to bring out the unity of the Creator even within the worldly matters. And it says, even though this is kind of a true concept, but the way that Korach was going about it was a little bit wrong. Because it's true that Hashem's unity is mainly found in the worldly matters, in the details of our daily lives. But in order that our foot does not falter, in order that when we go out into the world and know Hashem in all of our ways, which is the foot, in order that recognition of the Creator's unity through our worldly business dealings should not falter, it says that's why we need to have Hashem place our soul in a place that's beyond our own nature, which is essentially, in the simple point, this is Korach's mistake, was he separated himself from Moshe. He relied on his own nature. We're all holy. He said everyone's holy. He relied on the own nature of his soul. The own nature of his soul, even if his nature might be alive in essence, he still relied on his own nature. But the point is that it's not enough to rely on our nature. We need Hashem to place our soul in life, which is mainly in the story of Korach. You can see the main power that Korach could have had was he could have been subservient to Moshe. And through Moshe, which represents the spirituality and the nullification of Hashem in the spiritual, that could have given Korach the anchor to take the spiritual, and with that spiritual anchor of knowing Hashem in all of our ways, which is in the spiritual unification with Hashem through prayer and through Torah study, when we have that anchor of the spirituality, only then can we go out into the world and properly realize the unity of Hashem, even within the worldly things. If we just go out on our own and rely on our own nature, even if our own nature might be alive in essence, that's still not enough. That still might cause the foot, which is the worldly matters of the person in the world, to falter. In order so that our foot should not falter, we have to have the life that's beyond our own nature, which is the power that we have from Moshe and the Rebbe, to give us the power not only to go in the ultimate path of the natural world, but to also have miracles within nature. As that's the whole point of the coming redemption, the 12th of Tammuz, where we have nature and beyond nature rooted together. It's within nature, but we also have to have, it's not enough only to rely on nature. Even if the nature is a very great thing, we also have to have beyond nature. We have to have the unification with the Rebbe and the Moshe, every generation. basically.
Sorry. It's good. In that sense, it's not enough to rely on nature also.
Yeah, it says if we were only rely on our own nature might be Hasam nafshenu. But says our own nature, the own nature of the soul is alive in essence, which is a very great level. But even though the soul is alive in essence, it says that Hashem still has to put our soul in life, so that it, which is a higher level of life that the soul has on its own. Even though the soul on its own has alive in essence, in order that the foot should not falter, it has to have a type of life that's beyond its own nature, even if its own nature is a very high level. And another point, another elaboration of that, which elaborates out the maamar, says that the Korach's name also is related to the word for ice. Ice referring to the sky that separates between the lower waters and the higher waters. And it says, and not only that, but it says when it says in the beginning of the parsha, last week's parsha, that Korach took, the word taking, Onkelos translates taking as he argued, which is not the translation of taking at all. But all the commentaries say that the idea of Korach wanted to take this idea of argument. He didn't just want to argue because he had a different opinion. He wanted the argument for the sake of argument, because he was related to the sky that separates between the lower waters and the higher waters, which is related to this whole idea that we're saying this whole time. And the reason for that is because water in general is a source of delight, even though water itself delights, because it makes everything grow, and the things that grow have taste and delight, even though the water itself has no taste. But because it makes everything grow and the things that grow have taste, so water itself has within itself the idea of tainug, delight. So the lower waters and upper waters that were separated on the second day represents the source of physical delights being separated from the source of spiritual delights. There's a concept of spiritual water which can make spiritual delights, and also physical water makes physical delights. But Korach, whose name and action represented the division of the second day, he wanted this division of the two waters, because he realized, Korach, like we said this whole time, that Korach was obsessed with the unity of Hashem within the physical world, within the many details, because even though there's many details, even within the many, you can still see the unity of Hashem. So that's related to the lower waters, the source of the physical delights, which is also ultimately the source of physicality. Korach wanted the lower waters to be separated from the upper waters, which means that he wanted the recognition of the physical to be separate from the recognition of the spiritual. Because it says the source of this physicality is actually rooted in a greater source than the spiritual, ultimately, which is a true concept as well. But the mistake that Korach made is that this idea that we'll be able to realize Hashem's unity within the concealment, within the Tzimtzum itself, says that will only be when Mashiach comes. Well, that will only be in the future time. But in the meantime, in order that we should have the power to realize this source of the lower waters, the source of the physicality is greater than spiritual, it's not enough just to go only to the physical and try to realize Hashem's unity based on our own nature within the physical. We need to have a higher source. It says the lower waters separate from the higher waters. In order for the lower waters, it says they cry out and they say, oh, we want to be next to the king. Like they say, oh, it's not fair. The upper waters get to be next to the king, next to Hashem. The lower waters that are separated, because they're separated, then they get to cry out. They cry out in agony and say, we want to be next to the king. And through the crying out, then they can reach even greater than the upper waters. Then they're able to go ascend. So meaning, even though ultimately the source of the lower waters, the source of the physicality, in its own place is ultimately greater than the spiritual, but that we're not able to realize that on our own. Korach's mistake is that he tried to go with his own nature. He tried to realize the unity of Hashem and the physicality on his own. But the truth is that on the third day, it says when the dry land appeared, then dry land was a place where humans would be created. So the third day represents the beginning of this unification of the two waters, which ultimately happened in the temple when the water was offered on the temple on the altar through people, which basically represents the idea of that through our actions of going to the spirituality through Torah and Tefillah and davening, then we're able to elevate the physical, the spiritual, or to the spiritual. Elevate the lower waters to the upper waters. Korach wanted that the lower waters should remain not elevated. He said that he thought that the way to realize the source of the lower waters was to keep them in their place, which essentially means that he wanted, like we said again, this is all one idea. Like he wanted to see Hashem's unity only within the physical, and he did not want to go to Moshe. He didn't want to connect himself to the spiritual as a spiritual anchor. He wanted to only rely on his own nature to try to see Hashem's unity within the physical. He says, but really, that's the mistake. The mistake is that we can't rely on our own nature. We have to have the strength of the upper waters, which is the strength of Moshe. Moshe is the idea of Tiferes, of beauty, which is the third day. Moshe himself represents the third day of creation, which is the unity of the upper and lower waters. So really, Korach himself, Korach's name means ice, which his name itself, which was given like by Hashem, so to speak, since he was born. That's the nature of Korach was related to the idea of the sky separating the upper and lower waters. So that was just based on his own nature. So Hashem made him in a way where he was related to he had this like tendency to be related to the division of upper and lower waters. So that itself was not necessarily bad. So when Korach initially had the first argument with Moshe, which became from his argument of wanting to separate the physical and the spiritual, that itself could have been good, because throughout the Parsha, Moshe was talking to Korach, trying to get Korach to do teshuvah. So if Korach would have listened to Moshe, then we could have had like this idea of the lower waters getting separated in order that they should go in a higher level than the upper waters. So we could have had this idea of separation for the sake of going even higher. But because Korach did not want to associate, he didn't want to become nullified to Moshe. He wasn't humble enough to give himself over to Moshe. So therefore he wanted to rely on his own nature only. And he wanted the lower waters to stay in their own place in order to try to realize the purpose of the concealment itself. Like the idea of the concealment, the Tzimtzum, it says really it has two main reasons. Hashem hides himself. Why does Hashem hide himself? Because at the beginning of creation there was infinite light filling everywhere, nothing else could exist. Then Hashem hides himself, hides all of that infinite light completely so he could exist. But it's not only concealment for no reason, it's a concealment in order that once we exist, we can now, through the Torah and the mitzvahs, we can now create that same revelation that existed before creation, the infinite light. Through the Torah mitzvahs, we can bring that same revelation into the world now that we exist. And not only that, but since we still exist, we can not only bring the same revelation that existed before creation into the world through the mitzvahs, but we can also bring an even greater revelation into the world that never existed before. So that is all related to this idea of the lower waters getting separated for the sake of them getting higher. But it says really there's a second purpose of the Tzimtzum, of the concealment itself, which is not a concealment for the sake of a revelation, but rather it says it's just a concealment for the sake of concealment itself, which is the idea of concealment for the sake of concealment, because there's an aspect of how the Atzmus, how the Creator reveals himself, which is beyond, meaning the Creator reveals himself both in a way of being revealed and being concealed. When we say that the Atzmus is concealed, that's like so to speak, a more like essential aspect of the Atzmus removing himself, so to speak, from everything else in order to create the concealment, which is a source of like how everything is created from nothing. So this is a deeper level of the concealment, a concealment for the sake of the concealment itself. That's what Korach wanted to jump ahead to get to right away. It says there's two purposes. First, the purpose of the concealment for the revelation. Then there's a concealment for the sake of the concealment. Korach wanted to skip right ahead to the end goal. He wanted to skip right ahead to the concealment for the sake of the concealment, which is only going to be revealed through Mashiach. But the point that he was missing is that in order to reach this true essential state of the concealment within the concealment without letting our feet falter, it's only through being nullified to Moshe, only through having the first idea, only through having the concealment for the sake of the revelation, which is the revelations that come through the nullification to Moshe and the Torah and the Tefillah as the main thing. Only through that nullification of the revelations, only through the revelations can we reach the essence. It's not enough just to skip right ahead to the end result and try to rely on our own nature. We have to be given over to the Rebbe, to the Moshe, to have that nullification, to have that bittul, that self-nullification, so that we can't rely on our own nature. We have to have this life that's beyond nature in order that our feet should not falter. And that's the ultimate state of when Mashiach should come.
Right.
Hope that you could
feel a little something.
I'm still looking on your face.
Koyach Godel, Mimenu Yiru Kol Atmimim. Avem Bet Beine von den Tmimim Chazen Amayme, allemal sehr gerät. Hadub Mechaye von der lebendige Tome Machosid, Hashem should bench you and be Memale Kol Meshalas Levofa, Tevel, Levrocha, Bakel, Mikkel, Koil, the main bracha we should all have. Mashiach now.